Hi everybody. So there's a concept knocking around in jazz education circles which is called avoid notes. And the actual definition of an avoid note really sort of varies from kind of school to school and book to book. I first came across the term when I was looking at the Mark Levine Jazz Theory book, which is a book that a lot of people have read and popular textbook. And Mark Levine in it talks about the avoid note and says he doesn't really like the name. He'd prefer to call it a handle with care note. So a very good example is if we just take a C major 7th chord and we go up the major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Now those notes 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. All of those notes sound good against the basic C major 7th chord. With the possible exception of 1, you normally harmonise 1 with a minor 6, major 6th. But the one that really stands out is the 4th, because the 4th will sound incredibly dissonant against that chord. It's like, whoa. And it's interesting because that chord belongs to the diatonic scale of that chord, right? That note belongs to the diatonic scale of the chord. So this phenomenon was kind of the centerpiece or founding sort of stone of George Russell's Lydian chromatic concept, which is highly influential. George Russell said that the natural scale of the major chord was in fact the Lydian with a raised 4th, not a natural one. So instead of going 4, 4, at least if it's in tune, that has a much more of a resolved sound or a connected sound to that basic chord than than this, for instance. Than the 4th. So I think that's quite well known by a lot of jazz students. Now, the interesting thing is about the 4th is actually I think it's the thing that makes chord progressions go, right? So if you sort of sit down and you divide the scale into two categories of diatonic 7th chords, for instance, one's with a 4th in and one's without, you get like C major, E minor 7th, and A minor 7th as chords without an F, without a 4th in, okay? And then the other chords like D minor 7, B flat minor 7 flat 5, G7, and F major are all the sort of standard kind of what Cheryl Bailey calls family of 4 substitutions for the dominant chord. So in fact, that kind of describes chord progressions quite nicely. There's two basic functions in the major key. There's a sort of function of chords that don't have the 4th in, which we might think of as tonic chords, such as 1, 3, and 6. And then sort of dissonant chords that do want to resolve, or one, if not dissonant, certainly slightly standing apart chords like D minor 7 or F major, and then actual resolving chords like B minor 7 flat 5 and G7, for instance. And that's something I've kind of find quite useful as a concept. So I prefer to see the F then not as an avoid note, but as a sort of active tone in the C major tonality. It has a lot of power. And actually, if you think of like melodies that sit on the 4th, such as Stella by Starlight, it's this very emotive sound. Think of Radiohead. Okay, the edginess of that note actually creates a lot of emotion, a lot of tension in the melody. So I am a little bit, it's going to come up again probably in this video. I'm a little bit leery about this quite prohibitive, prescriptive language that gets used in a lot of jazz educational materials. I think even handle with care is perhaps putting it the wrong way. It's like, be brave, use that F to evoke an emotion. Don't just sort of try to avoid it. You're meant to be a musician, so the important thing is to recognise the qualities of the different sounds and be able to employ them for emotional and communicative effect in your music. That's what I think anyway. Okay. Now this works quite well in terms of basic avoid notes. It works quite well if you kind of use the relative minor. So for instance on an A minor, if I do the F, again, you've got a very tense sound. This, by the way, always makes you think of the music to Twin Peaks. Ya, ya, da, ya, ya, ya. Boom. Okay. It has that kind of creepiness and tension about it. It's Badalamenti, who is a genius, by the way, used it very effectively in the context of that music. Another example might be, think of the Matrix music, for instance. I don't know why I'm thinking music scores, but that initial chord, it isn't in this key, but it is basically a major chord with an added flat sixth. It's a minor chord, sorry, with an added flat sixth. It's this kind of thing. So it's like, let me see if I can actually play that. Yeah, it is basically this. That's the sound of the Matrix score, really. Probably in a different key, but that's how that's that basic chord quality. So you can see it's a resource. The reason why I might call them avoid notes, by the way, is because they don't really form sort of conventionally nice voicings in the same way that maybe if I used a seventh in that chord, that's a much more resolved tonality. It sort of just feels like it sits there. Same obviously with the sharp 11th. Interestingly, by the way, if I put a sixth in there, in like a natural sixth on the A minor, that is considered an avoid note against A minor 7. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so these avoid notes, these two, the fourth on the C and a flat sixth on the A minor, are powerful, very tense, very emotive dissonances that are present in the diatonic key, right? In jazz, we've kind of somewhat relaxed the dissonance of the seventh. We see that as being a blending tone, and have done, I think, pretty much since the early days. But that fourth retains its power and sort of emotional tension, as does the flat sixth, probably because those notes don't really belong to the overtone spectrum. And if you want to know more about that, you can probably go and search out an Adam Neely video. Doesn't really matter why, but that is certainly the effect of them. Now, what I want to show you is how this note, which can be oof, I mean, isn't that a great sound, but also quite, I mean, that doesn't sound like any kind of major chord. It's like oof. Now, if I then flap the seventh of that chord from B to B flat, can you hear that it's no longer dissonant? And yet, the theory tells us that the fourth is still an avoid note over the dominant. And this is where people get a bit confused, I think, including Mark Levine. He spends several pages kind of going, well, most 1930s jazz musicians didn't use the fourth on dominant chords. That's not true. And then he goes on about how it kind of thirds and fourths against each other, became acceptable in the 60s and so on. And he sort of spins out this whole kind of narrative about it. And the thing is, I think actually it would have been as easier if you just said, like, the fourth isn't an avoid note on a dominant, because it isn't. I think in chord scale theory, they kind of make out that it is. And I don't know why they do this, apart from the fact that they've got a theory that doesn't, a theory of avoid notes that doesn't always work. It's something like when it's a semitone away from a chord tone or something, it's like, yeah, but that doesn't make any sense, because there's, even as a rule, that's kind of not consistent. And certainly if you listen to them with your ears, you can tell that that dissonance is kind of interesting, whereas this is kind of, I mean, it's interesting for sure, but it's much stronger, right? And part of the reason for that, I think, is because you have the B flat and the F go together in a nice consonant interval, the perfect fifth. So it kind of makes sense, in the same way that the ninth in a dominant chord, for instance, if I play that note, that kind of relates by consonant interval, and the perfect fifth is well intonated and equal temperament. That relates to another consonant interval to another note in the chord, and ninth, of course, relates to the fifth. And the fourth relates to the seventh, the flat seventh. So in that case, I mean, it's really, that's the end of the video, and it's like, oh, well, we don't need to worry about the fourth on a dominant chord then. It always sounds great. Just ask Wes Montgomery, right? Or Lester Young, or Charlie Christian. So, I just wanted to clear that up, and I think like it's so easy sometimes to take what these theory books say at face value that actually it kind of makes us think that we know how these things sound when actually we don't. Maybe, I don't know. It's becoming a bit of a theme of my channel, I suppose. So there's a couple of interesting-ish related issues, and the first thing is that basically in a 2-5-1 you have traditionally 3 chords: the subdominant, which is a chord with a 4th in; dominant, which is usually thought of as being a chord with a 4th and a 7th in, right? So you get this, and then tonic chord, which is like got 7th, 3rd, all that kind of stuff. In practice, if you go out and look at the recordings and what people actually played in solos and stuff, you'll maybe notice that actually not always is there a 2 chord in a 2-5-1, and not always is there a 5 chord in a 2-5-1. For instance, I always use the example of this West Montgomery lick, which is interesting because it doesn't actually contain like the obvious note of the dominant chord, which is the 3rd, which is the the 7th of the key, which in classical theory is the thing that makes it a dominant chord. In fact, we just ignore that and play a flat 7 instead, or a flat 3, or a sharp 9 of the dominant chord G9. You can hear how kind of cool that is, and it doesn't use that note. The note that it's mostly interested in is the 4th. So that's a good example of a 2-5-1 lick that doesn't actually use the 5 chord. It's kind of, if you like, it's using a sort of minor subdominant thing and going straight to 1. You could see it as being like, a sort of, F minor-y thing going to F minor 11th sort of thing going to C major. And that freedom, I think, is important. I think, again, like if you look at the sort of the theory books, the chord scale theory books, they'll tell you, for instance, that if you're playing on a 2 chord, you don't want to use the 13th. So, your Dorian bowed shouldn't contain a 13th in that voicing. So things like, D minor 9, D minor 11th, of various kinds, that's fine, but you don't really want this. You don't really want for instance, that sound, because that sound, quote, gives away the dominant. And I think that makes sense from the perspective of, arranging, because, that dominant sound, if you want a voicing that has the dominant sound in it, then you'll probably want to reserve that for a 5 chord. So from the point of view of, writing out voicings for a band, that logic makes sense. But for improvisation, I think it actually gets in the way because it causes you to overthink. You think like, can I use the 4th over the dominant? And then you get into the idea that you have to, move the 2 to the 5 at the same time as the accompaniment does, which is total rubbish. I mean, you just need to transcribe really to see that people don't do that. So I think as always, but I mean, hopefully I've demonstrated that even as a voicing, that is an unusual but pretty pleasing to me sound, and perhaps people should use that sound more often, and perhaps they're not using that sound more often because they've been told not to in theory books. I don't know. I think the only thing to do is to trust your ears and to treat all of these theories with some skepticism, because I think the actual sounding reality of it is much more complex. Yeah. So again, like, I trust your ears. Basically, I suppose that's the theme of this channel. And no, the 4th is not really an avoid note over the dominant. Use it with freedom and abandon everything else, and to be honest, do that with the 4th over a major 7th as well. If you know how it sounds and you use it on purpose, it can't be wrong.